Hello everyone, and welcome to what is basically part 2 of the Majima Doppelganger theory. That video got a lot of traction, and it had a lot of people who played along with the joke, who asked some very good questions and provided some very good insight about the theory. With help from all of you, I can finally answer some of the biggest questions that Doppelganger theory leaves us with, such as why Gaiden is the last game in Timeline 2, and what actually happened to Doppelganger. That's what I plan to discuss today. I can now definitively present the true answer to Doppelganger theory. Before getting into the meat and potatoes, I've selected a handful of comments which I plan to address, whether they be questions or potential additions to the theory. We're starting with the questions that have pretty straightforward answers. I'll go over these in chronological order of the timelines. Our first question is about the timeline split. One commenter brings up a very good point about Timeline 2. Assuming that Majima does kill Makoto in Timeline 2, Shimano would most likely take this opportunity to grab the empty lot. If this were to happen, Shimano would likely become chairman, which would have drastic effects on the timeline. And yeah, that's completely correct. So how do I explain the fact that the timeline does proceed as normal, with Seta becoming chairman? My best answer to this is the fact that the three timelines that matter to Doppelganger theory are likely not the only timelines to exist. There are likely many timelines where Shimano does get the empty lot and does become chairman, but know that this does not happen in our timeline too. RGG will probably clarify this when Kiwami 0 comes out for the 30th anniversary, but my best guess as to what happens in Timeline 2 is that Timeline 2 Kiryu is just that guy. If he is much stronger and smarter at this point in the timeline than Timeline 1 Kiryu, and he's somehow able to resolve the entire situation favorably without Majima, it could make sense. Like I said, I really need RGG to provide some more detail on this, but this would at the very least line up with how Timeline 2 Majima doesn't even try to do Majima everywhere. Kiryu is just that much stronger and wiser in this timeline at that point that he doesn't consider any kind of rehabilitation necessary. I know this isn't a very airtight explanation, but it's the best that I have until RGG decides to pick up the slack. That brings us to the next comment, which is about Majima's different tattoo in Yakuza 1, which caused this commenter to ask if there is yet another doppelganger. That would really fuck with the timeline, but thankfully this is something we have an official explanation for. RGG just didn't know what Majima's tattoo would be yet, and they didn't finalize it until Yakuza 2. Yeah, I didn't mention this because it's the one thing that seems connected to Doppelganger theory, but actually isn't. But I suppose I should clarify that no, this is not connected to the theory. The next one is one that I was honestly expecting. Where does Kiwami 3 fit into this? Well, considering the game isn't out yet, I can't make a fully confident call. I'm leaning towards Timeline 2 considering that some characters look completely different.
And they decided to add the sex offender to the timeline where Majima is also a sex offender.
And also that Okinawa style never appears in Yakuza 4 despite Kiryu still being in Okinawa. But like I said, I'll have to wait until the game comes out first. As for Dark Ties, it really could go either way. I have no idea. I think it's worth mentioning the fact that Dark Ties is at least partially adapted from RGG Online. And to be clear, no, I will not be counting anything from RGG Online. That stuff's canonicity is dubious at best. Next up, I got a few people asking about heat aura colors. Specifically, they asked about why I only pointed out the Majima's heat aura inconsistencies, while neglecting other characters. Specifically pointing out Saejima and Daigo, who have the same yellow aura that Timeline 2 Majima does in Gaiden. Yes, many characters do have inconsistent aura colors. Kiryu's Dragon of Dojima style has been red, white, and blue, Saejima's style has been blue, red, yellow, and green, Daigo's has been blue, yellow, and purple. Generally, characters can change their aura color. Hell, all 4 characters in Yakuza 5 that actually fight people can change their aura from blue to red on command. The reason I pointed out Majima, his Mad Dog style to be specific, is that this is an exception to the rule. While it has changed shades, the Mad Dog style has always been purple outside of Kiwami 2, which features Doppelganger, and Gaiden. What I neglected to talk about though, is that this heat aura discrepancy actually has a big impact on Gaiden's story. Timeline 2 Majima has always had the same purple aura as Timeline 1 Majima, with the exception of Gaiden. We'll circle back to this one later, as it ties into another comment. A few commenters brought up the case of Jungi Han. who we know dies during Yakuza 6, and is replaced with a body double come Yakuza 7. This replacement is explicitly stated to not be magical in nature, as the new Jungi was given plastic surgery in order to look identical to the old one. I saw some people questioning if Doppelganger was not a magically summoned clone, but instead a body double of this nature. It doesn't make any sense for Doppelganger to be a body double. There's no evidence for it, and we literally know that Majima practices cloning magic, so I don't see how this could be the case. Alright, we have 2 more questions before we get to the good stuff. I got a question about Doppelganger's role in Yakuza 6. To clarify, Yakuza 6 is a Timeline 1 game which features Doppelganger, as the real Majima is still in prison during this timeline. Both real Majimas are arrested towards the end of Yakuza 4. Timeline 2 Majima is released before the end of 4, but Timeline 1 Majima is released after Yakuza 6. As a result, Timeline 1 Majima brings Doppelganger back from Timeline 3 prior to the end of 4 to take his place while he is imprisoned. If this is the case though, why does Doppelganger act more like the real Majima during his scene in Yakuza 6? This ties into one of the big talking points I have, but to give a brief statement about it, there is a very large aspect of Doppelganger's character arc that was brought to my attention which explains this discrepancy. The final question involves infinite wealth. Dead Souls is stated by Kiryu to be a dream that he had, and this commenter speculates that he may have some ability to see into other timelines. This certainly explains why the samurai games are also explained as dreams, but this power has not received enough elaboration by RGG to be anything concrete. So, the big stuff. Like I said, there is one piece of evidence that completely recontextualizes Doppelganger's arc. Ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between, let's not forget Majima no Majirock. Majima no Majirock is a karaoke song from Kurohyou 2. This song is sung by one of the Majimas, and crucially, has a fully animated music video. Just based off of what we know about the timeline, if we assume that this music video takes place around when Kurohyou 2 does, in 2012 but before the bulk of Yakuza 5, we know that Majima is still in jail and Doppelganger is currently filling in for him.
Taking a look at the music video, it also seems consistent for Doppelganger.
He crashes a truck into a Yakuza office in a manner very similar to how he did in Kiwami, and he even sets the building on fire after he's done with everyone inside. However, there's one important detail that changes everything we know about Doppelganger. He does this for the sake of someone else. He did it to rescue a hostess who got kidnapped by this specific family. This is very different from the Doppelganger we know. But what if I told you that this is actually a sign of character growth for Doppelganger? Taking a look at the English translation of the lyrics, courtesy of the Yakuza Wiki, we can see that this song is likely written from Doppelganger's perspective. If it isn't obvious enough by the first actual lyric of the song being, "Don't got any interest in the footprints left by someone else," we can tell that this song describes Doppelganger and his feelings about his current state, with this opening lyric describing how he feels about his relation to the real Majima. He depicts this relation as a rotting distinguishment that attracts the dregs. The lyrics and chorus that follow are meant to represent Doppelganger's love of chaos. In this town with its crude and beautiful neon lights, my reward is an ego-shattering fight. What are you searching for? What aren't you afraid of? Be grateful of it all. Brandish a smile, muster your courage and rise. The gods are celebrating this moment. Scream with all your might. Don't give me the answer. Come on, let's do this. Rage and pain are my pride. If there is a hell, you're going to see it. This is all well and good, but what comes after the first chorus is what I consider the most interesting. Cast aside your place of comfort. Your life of exhilaration is over. Wake up and take a close look. Now, show me your way of life. This is reality. Everything starts from zero. March forward with all your might, and don't bet everything on a life half-lived. Now, get on your feet. Don't dwell on your fears and your despair. A rapturous world awaits you. I take this to mean that Doppelganger is becoming discontent with his ways, and wants to make something more of his life. It's why he talks about casting aside his place of comfort. His life of exhilaration is over. He started from zero, and he doesn't want his life to be half-lived. These lyrics match up with him actually making a difference in someone's life within the music video. He wants to become more than just the chaotic, accidental clone of Majima. He wants to burst out of his shadow in a way that matters.
Hi guys, Editing Curve here.
One thing that I caught upon rewatching the music video in closer detail is a very interesting visual motif that actually adds to this idea of Doppelganger trying to distance himself from Majima and to try and be his own person. In the music video, we often see Doppelganger's face, specifically the left side of his face, the one with the eye patch. We often see it obscured in some way. It's either panned away from the camera, or it is baked in this very harsh darkness. And this whole motif is set up by a shot that's in the early portion of the music video, where you can see here, it juxtaposes these two different sides of Majima. We have this sort of normal side of Majima and this dark side of Majima, and this dark side of Majima is meant to represent Doppelganger, of course. This sort of dark Majima uses an inverted color palette, which is a recurring theme in this art style. Now, crucially, towards the end of the song, when Majima actually breaks into the Yakuza office to relieve the hostess of, like, her debt, I'm guessing, which I'm guessing what he burns at the end is some kind of debt record or something. We see that, when he's got the actual boss of the family cornered, and, the final chorus drops, we see that his face is actually now in the standard color palette, and it's actually in the same brightness that the original Majima's is. And indeed, after this point in the song, we do see his full face normally not caked in the dark color palette. I think this is a very interesting way to visually represent his growth as a character, and I thought it is an important thing to mention. I think that this development explains why the Doppelganger we see in Yakuza 6 regards Saejima with such fondness, and is seemingly keeping tabs on Kiryu while he's hospitalized. We see him attempting to become a better person, only for his dream to be ripped away from him by Kurosawa. By the time he's freed again at the beginning of Yakuza 6, he chooses to spend what little time he has left in this timeline watching over Kiryu and spending time with Saejima. He knows that he'll be whisked away once again once he's no longer needed, so he chooses to make the most of the time he has. In his own words, don't bet everything on a life half-lived. I got a comment from Fractus Durham on the previous video, and they shared their ideas about what happens in Timeline 2 during and after Gaiden. I don't agree with everything they said, but their ideas served as a major jumping off point for mine, and they were also the first person to bring Majima no Majirock to my attention. I am now of the belief that the yellow aura Majima we see in Gaiden is, in fact, Doppelganger. Think about it. Neither Timeline 1 nor Timeline 2 Majima have ever changed their Mad Dog aura color. Doppelganger is the only one who has shown this ability. We know that Doppelganger was sent to a different timeline sometime after his final Timeline 1 appearance in 2012. What if he was actually sent to Timeline 2? What if Timeline 2 Majima dies at the end of Yakuza 5 and Doppelganger is sent to Timeline 2 to take his place? Let's contemplate this for a minute. Let's first discuss the evidence that leads me to believe that this is possible. If we assume that this is true, it would line up with how both Majimas are completely absent for the majority of Yakuza 6. It would imply that Doppelganger was pulled into Timeline 2 to fill the hole left by that Majima's death, rather than being actively sent there by Timeline 1 Majima. It would certainly explain the heat aura discrepancy as well. There's also the scene at the end of Kiryu's part in 5 where Majima is stated to be dead. Now, we know that he isn't actually dead at this point in time, and that this is part of Kurosawa's plan. I do believe that this could serve as foreshadowing for his actual death that occurs sometime between the end of Yakuza 5 and the beginning of Timeline 2's version of Yakuza 6. I'd like to take a small detour here to look at the idea of Doppelganger being passively sent into other timelines. If Doppelganger serves as a kind of replacement for Majima if he dies in a specific timeline before he's supposed to, or is otherwise unavailable when needed, it could mean that he wasn't forcefully banished into Timeline 3 after Kiwami 2, and was rather sent there after the assumed death of Timeline 3 Majima. Furthermore, this also means that Majima has never explicitly antagonized Doppelganger, which is actually a nice detail considering a part of Doppelganger's arc which I talk about later. You may ask if this means that Doppelganger potentially existed before his known creation date, and came to Timeline 1 from another timeline entirely. but I still believe that he was created by Timeline 1 Majima, considering that Timeline 1 is the only instance where we've seen Doppelganger and one of the real Majimas existing in the same timeline concurrently. While Timeline 1 Majima technically doesn't die when he is arrested in Yakuza 4, Doppelganger was likely sent back to Timeline 1 to take his place temporarily, considering that he was imprisoned for longer than in other timelines. Assuming that Doppelganger is pulled into Timeline 2 to replace Timeline 2 Majima after his death, it means that the Majima we see in Gaiden is Doppelganger. Looking at his post-dissolution dialogue in Gaiden, he tries to get Kiryu to stay in the same way that he did for Saejima in Yakuza 6, which lines up with the development we saw in 6 and in Majima no Majirock. Knowing that Doppelganger is, in fact, in Timeline 2 post-2012, I can finally discuss the single biggest addition I have to Doppelganger theory: the Great Timeline 2 Cataclysm. The answer to Timeline 2, and by extension, Doppelganger's ultimate fate, can be found in Gaiden. Gaiden is not only the final game we know of in Timeline 2, it is also the end of Timeline 2. I have a theory about this, so bear with me for a minute. If it's true that the real Majima dies in Timeline 2, we can assume that this creates a critical instability in the timeline, especially when considering that this timeline only exists due to Majima's actions. Doppelganger is brought to Timeline 2 as a sort of band-aid fix, but this does not fix the permanent damage caused by Majima's death. If the timeline were to experience another extreme, universe-altering event, the instability would be far too great, and the timeline would surely collapse. Timeline 1 is far more stable, as the real Majima is still alive and well, and it could handle an extreme event of this nature much more comfortably. One such event is that of the Tojo and Omi dissolution. In Timeline 1, we know that this occurs smoothly. The timeline can handle this event, and continues into Infinite Wealth and Pirate Yakuza. In Timeline 2, the dissolution is the final major event that we know of. We can assume that the timeline begins to break down, and eventually collapses. Let's go through what we know about Gaiden that can support this theory. The one major difference between Gaiden's version of the dissolution and Yakuza 7's version of the dissolution is the interference by one Kosei Shishido. Shishido, I believe, is a very important piece of this puzzle. Shishido's main motivation at the end of Gaiden is to overthrow the main players of the dissolution and ensure that the Yakuza as an institution lives to see another day. But when recontextualizing the dissolution as an event that literally decides the fate of this timeline, it also recontextualizes Shishido's character and motivations. Shishido and all of the other characters may not know the true gravity of the situation, but Shishido still serves as the perfect personification of the timeline's will to continue. Let's examine Shishido a little closer, beginning by looking at his tattoo. This tattoo depicts the Shishi, a mythical lion from Buddhist and Shintoist belief, which Shishido himself is even named after. Statues of the Shishi are often erected in pairs in front of shrines and temples. One Shishi has its mouth open, and the other has its mouth closed. Shishido's tattoo depicts the open-mouthed Shishi, which is meant to ward off evil spirits from the shrine or temple that it protects. In this context, Shishido himself is metaphorically acting as a protector for both the Yakuza and the timeline as a whole, and is trying to fight back against the people attempting to destroy it. This idea is further symbolized in Shishido's boss fight. Over the course of the fight, Shishido is slowly dragged farther and farther away from the meeting room, which serves as the metaphorical heart of the Omi Alliance. This continues until he is ultimately cast out of the building entirely. This idea is complemented by the music within the fight. This fight has 3 music tracks: Onsyu, Deadly Struggle, and Hakanaki Yume. Onsyu is the build-up track that plays during the pre-fight cutscene and the dynamic intro. The title of the track simply translates to enemy as far as I can tell, but this makes sense if we assume that the song is to be viewed from Shishido's perspective, which lines up with the other tracks. Deadly Struggle is the song that plays during the first 3 phases of the fight that take place inside of the building. This is an intense metal theme that represents Shishido's determination to defeat Kiryu and prevent the timeline's collapse. The final phase of the fight plays Hakanaki Yume, or Fleeting Dream. It's a much more somber track for when the reality sets in that Shishido cannot prevent the timeline's collapse. Fleeting Dream not only represents the feudal final stand of Shishido, but it's also the swan song of the timeline he's trying to protect. The song is called Fleeting Dream not only because of Shishido's lost aspirations, but because the final chance to save Timeline 2 from its fate has similarly slipped through his fingers. I believe that the final scenes of Gaiden really hammer this in. The last thing we see in this game is Kiryu bidding Hanawa farewell, before jumping forward in time to Kiryu leaving Yumi's ring at a church. The shot of Kiryu walking away, I believe, is symbolic of the end of Timeline 2. Kiryu is obviously the series' main protagonist, and the simple "so long" before fading to black represents the timeline's collapse. The flash forward into 2023 is obviously a glimpse into Timeline 1. While this scene is obviously about Kiryu's relationship with Yumi, it also represents the sad fate of Timeline 2. Think about it. What kind of events are hosted at churches? Weddings, of course, but also funerals. If the idea of Kiryu being able to see into other timelines is true, this could lend credibility to this idea. Either way though, the juxtaposition of the symbolic death of Timeline 2 and the symbolic funeral of Timeline 2 seems like an intentional choice. And the ring could represent the merging, or marriage, of the timelines, which I will discuss shortly. So what does the collapse of Timeline 2 mean in the bigger picture? Simply put, everyone in that timeline has been effectively erased. This, sadly, includes Doppelganger. He's dead. With a small asterisk. We need to talk about Pirate Yakuza some more. A few commenters suggested that Doppelganger had fused or otherwise become one with Timeline 1 Majima, which is why Majima seems to act as a mix between himself and Doppelganger after getting amnesia, and why he also has Doppelganger's memories. I had considered this possibility, but it never made sense before, as Majima didn't have a way to get rid of him outside of banishing him to Timeline 3. But if Doppelganger was basically crunched into a pile of magical timeline dust, then it could very well happen. Fractus Derm suggested something else that I thought was interesting. What if Timeline 2 Majima, Timeline 2 Saejima, and Timeline 2 Daigo were reincarnated as the weapons that Majima uses in Pirate Yakuza? Think about it. Majima becomes the cutlasses due to his affinity for bladed weapons, and the fact that there's two of them represents the duality of the different Majimas. Saejima becomes the hook due to his immense grappling power, and Daigo becomes the gun for obvious reasons. Timeline 1 Majima is carrying the Jima trio on his body, and is carrying Doppelganger in his soul. This makes me think of Pirate Yakuza much differently. Majima is now carrying the remnants of Timeline 2 and Doppelganger, and I feel like that's something very interesting that the game sets up. Now, Pirate Yakuza is really bad at actually committing to its good ideas, so this is never really mentioned again, but we can extrapolate a few things from this game. There's one huge part of Pirate Yakuza that gets overlooked in regards to doppelganger theory, and it's none other than Raymond Law. Raymond Law is the final boss of Pirate Yakuza, and I believe that he has an important role in doppelganger theory, specifically as a foil to Shishido and main antagonist for Doppelganger. To make some quick comparisons to Shishido, I already explained how he is named after the Shishi, which is a symbol of protection. If we look at Raymond's name though, there are some similarities. The etymological origins of the name Raymond come from the old Germanic words Ragen or Regen, meaning counsel or advice, as well as Mund, meaning protection or protector. Shishido is named after a protector of spirituality, and Raymond's name means protector of law. Now, law can mean a few different things. Law can obviously refer to the rules of a society, and if we take that definition, yeah, he seems to be doing a pretty bad job at that. But if we interpret law in a different way, then we can start to get somewhere. Law can also mean the natural manner in which the universe is supposed to operate. This is a concept often used in various scientific fields. The laws of thermodynamics, for example, are a type of scientific law that defines how part of the universe are supposed to function. This definition can also be applied to more metaphysical concepts, like timelines. A third interpretation of the idea of law has to do with moral alignment. Someone who is lawful in character follows a strict moral and ethical code which dictates their actions and behavior. One's lawfulness is independent from whether or not they are good or evil in nature. With the scientific and moral definitions of law, we can view Raymond as a protector of the laws of reality and a protector of the law as a set of guiding principles. But how does this relate with his actual character? To answer that, let's look at his role in Pirate Yakuza's story. He's the main antagonist, of course, but what are his motivations? He's admittedly kind of a flatly written character, and his only real motivation is greed. I choose to believe that this is an intentional choice which clashes with his otherwise grandiose role as a protector of law. Raymond is meant to be a huge hypocrite who doesn't practice what he preaches. When looking at the legal definition of law, we can easily see that Raymond is operating outside of legal law, and intends to create his own kingdom of sorts, which is under his sole jurisdiction. This also ties to the moral definition. While his total greed seems to undermine the idea of him following a strict personal rulebook, remember that this rulebook does not have to be virtuous in nature. If we entertain the idea of Raymond wishing to impose his own ethical code onto everyone in Madlantis, it could line up with his role as the protector of law. The law that he is protecting is his own personal law. The scientific definition of law is the main reason that Majima, and by extension Doppelganger, butt heads with Raymond in the first place. If Raymond is supposed to be a protector of the natural order of the universe, then he probably doesn't enjoy all of the timeline meddling and cloning shenanigans that Majima has been involved in. Another thing that I'd like to bring up is the philosophical concept of natural law. Natural law is the idea that there exists an immutable moral and legal framework that is inherent to humanity and is independent from any human-made laws. I feel like the ideas of scientific laws and natural law combined are why Raymond is the final boss of Pirate Yakuza to begin with. It's a symbolic clash between him and Doppelganger. There is both an existential conflict and a conflict of ideals at play here. Raymond, being the symbolic protector of the laws of reality, is diametrically opposed to Doppelganger's very existence. At the same time, there's a conflict of ideals related to the idea of natural law. Raymond, despite being the protector of law, rejects the idea of an inherent moral code, and instead prioritizes his own law. Doppelganger, on the other hand, proves that you can always embrace the good that exists within you. Even if his methods are unconventional, he follows what his soul tells him is right. It's the ultimate battle between lawful evil and chaotic good. Let's contextualize this a little more. Majima, in this game, not only tries to rediscover who he is, but he's also carrying on the dream of Doppelganger, both in his heart and his soul. Doppelganger's story is one of tragedy. He starts out as a chaotic being with little direction, who is eventually cast away into another timeline due to his evils. By some stroke of luck, he's given another chance, and makes a meaningful effort to make something of his existence and mend himself into a force for good. Just as this happens, his dream is ripped from him, and he becomes little more than a pawn in Kurosawa's scheme. Even when he escapes this torture, he's once more thrusted into another timeline to serve as a replacement for a version of him that he never met. He tries again to make something of himself in this new existence he finds himself in, but he participates in the event that would lead to its destruction, ignorant to the fact that it would have such dire consequences. His soul finds refuge in none other than the man he was cloned from in the first place. Majima is figuratively and literally carrying Doppelganger with him. Even if Doppelganger does not have control over Majima, Majima still has his memories and his will. This brings us to the fight with Raymond. This fight is extremely underwhelming normally, but I think that it all comes together when keeping doppelganger theory in mind. To start, I need to emphasize just how great of a contrast Raymond is compared to Shishido. Both characters are symbolized as protectors. Shishido fights not only to protect the one thing that gives him a sense of belonging, but also to protect the existence of the very world that he lives in. Raymond does not fight to protect the law of the universe, as he is supposed to, but instead fights to protect his law, that he wishes to force everyone else to adopt. Raymond's convictions are much weaker and more sinister than Shishido's, and this is symbolized by one of the most long-standing traditions of this series. In nearly every Yakuza game, the final showdown begins with both the protagonist and the antagonist ripping off their shirts to reveal a tattoo that symbolizes them and their ideals. Shishido displays his tattoo loud and proud. Him displaying this tattoo showcases the strength of his resolve. He is so willing to fight for what he believes in that he puts it on his very skin and shows it off to the world. Raymond does not do this. He likely has no such tattoo in the first place. Instead, he dons a plain black shirt. His ideals are nothing more than a justification to get what he wants. Why would he bother symbolizing them in any flashy way? Before moving on, I do think that it's important to reiterate that neither Shishido nor Raymond are actively aware of their roles as protectors. They are simply acting in a way that represents their respective ideas of protection. Shishido protects the Yakuza, which represents his protection of Timeline 2, while Raymond protects the laws of the universe simply by being an opposing force to Majima, who breaks them. As a whole, I do think that this fight serves a dual purpose. Not only is it so Majima can beat down the big mastermind, but it also serves as a completion to Doppelgamer's character arc. I think that this fight is a sort of symbolic way for Doppelganger to apologize to Shishido, and to avoid making the same mistake twice. After losing Timeline 2, which was basically his home from 2012 to 2019, he vows to keep Timeline 1 as good of a place as it can be by stopping someone like Raymond who exploits it for personal gain, even if he can only do so by proxy. One final detail of the fight itself is the music. This fight has 2 tracks, Gold Devourer, which plays during the first 2 phases, and Unyielding Spirit, which plays during the final phase. Gold Devourer is simple. It's a very piratey song that represents Raymond's greed. Unyielding Spirit, on the other hand, is supposed to be from the point of view of Majima and Doppelganger. I believe the title is meant to be a double entendre. It not only refers to the strength of the Majima's resolve, but it also refers to the literal spirit of Doppelganger that resides within Majima. Finally, there's one last thing that I need to discuss. Do you know what Pirate Yakuza's main, overarching theme is? It's a game about acceptance. Changing the things about your life that can be changed, and finding peace with the things that can't. Noah finally gets the opportunity to see life beyond Rich Island that he always needed, and Jason comes to accept the fact that that's what would be best for him. Masaru changes the way he thinks about being loyal to a crew, and comes to accept that he belongs on the Goromaru. Rodriguez's father accepts that it's finally time for him to go, and that it would be best to get rid of the magic immortality rocks so that no one like Bryce can abuse them ever again. Raymond is incapable of accepting his position, and claws for more and more power until he's finally knocked down a peg by the Majimas. And as for Majima and Doppelganger, they're the most important ones. After defeating Raymond, Majima knocks him into a pool of water before he's eaten by a white whale. The white whale is an obvious reference to Moby Dick, which gave the term its modern meaning. A white whale is a goal that someone pursues above anything else, despite that goal being impossible to achieve. Remember the magic immortality rocks? Majima was searching for them as a way to cure Kiryu of his cancer. But what if Doppelganger was also looking for them? Even if he can only subconsciously influence Majima the tiniest amount, what if he hoped that the rocks could have given him a second chance? In the end though, both of them come to let go of their shared white whale. Majima accepts that this miracle cure for Kiryu is impossible to get his hands on, and chooses instead to spend whatever time he has left with him. Doppelganger is confronted with the same impossibility, and accepts his place as a part of Majima. As tragic as it is that he had to relieve himself of his material form and his agency, he finally gets the chance to live as the person he strived to be, even if he's only along for the ride. At the end of the day, I don't think it's impossible for Doppelganger to come back. There's always the possibility that Majima resummons him somehow, though I doubt Majima would actively try to do that. And honestly, Doppelganger doesn't need to come back. As bittersweet of an ending as he got, his arc is still complete. He got the chance to prove himself and make up for his mistakes. And at the very least, he now has a permanent home where he can rest, and live out his days as someone that he can be proud of. RGG loves retconning their characters though, so I sadly do think they might bring him back despite this. Either way, it's nice that I can finally have some peace knowing that his arc is concluded. And I hope you feel the same way. I sincerely doubt that I'll be making another video on Doppelganger theory. I've said pretty much all I need to say, and I really need to go back to making the history of Yakuza combos. Will I make more theory videos? Probably not, unless I come up with another really good one of this magnitude. I will have some more analytical content on this series out in the future though. That said, thanks for watching, #don't bring back Doppelganger, and I'll see you next time.